Hi, this is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video, I'm going to be demonstrating my do-it-yourself version of the Pilot Iro-utsushi dip pen. I made mine out of a Pilot Koküno that has an extra fine nib, and I just pulled out the nib and feed. They're just friction fit. If it's kind of tight and you need to give it just a little twist to break that friction, that's okay. And I replaced the feed with a piece of rolled up paper. I could see that the feed goes into the section about, if you look at it compared to my Rhodia pad, maybe just a little bit more than 5 millimeters. So I just got a scrap piece of paper off of my desk and folded it up and cut a little strip. Then I just rolled up that little strip, and depending on how big your piece of paper is, you may have to trim it. I did, to get it to fit in there. Now you want the paper and the feed to fit in there snug enough that the nib doesn't wiggle around, but not too tight. Now I've watched some videos demonstrating the real Pilot Iro-utsushi dip pen, and the nib on those pens have a little wavy line laser engraved across the breather hole. So that just shows you how deep to dip the nib. So on a dip pen like this, you'll just dip it up to the breather hole. And that's good because you don't want to get this paper in the ink. Now I've already tried this pen with a couple different inks, Grape Ice Pop, Bluegrass Velvet, and Writer's Blood, and it's working really well. So I made a few more dip pens out of a Pilot Explorer with a fine nib, and another Pilot Explorer with a medium nib, and my Pilot Metropolitan with a calligraphy medium nib. By the time I got to the calligraphy medium nib, I was getting not so good results, and I had considered making dip pens out of pens that I regularly use for writing samples, like the broad nib in my Kaweco Lilliput and the 1.5 stub nib in my Jinhao X750, but it looks like broader nibs that put down more ink aren't going to work for a dip nib like this because the nib itself cannot hold enough ink to make it practical to use. But I'm going to go ahead and try these 4 Pilot nibs with one more ink. I'm going to try Tokiwa Matsu. I'm going to begin with the extra fine. And this Sailor ink bottle I think is going to be nice to work with because it's got a nice wide mouth and I'll be able to see how far I'm dipping. Okay. Oh, yeah, there's a lot of ink there on the back of the feed. Let's see how that works out. That might be good, might be bad. Well, that was very nice. The writing was very uniform. I didn't have a big blob at the beginning and then it felt like it getting drier. It just wrote nice and uniformly until the very end. And you can see it used up all that ink that was on the back of the nib. Now, some of this I find is kind of luck. If you have a drip of ink that's not actually touching the nib slit, that ink will just be left on the nib. But this ink worked out nicely. All that ink was just stuck there in the middle, coming into contact with the nib slit, and it was just able to slowly pull the ink out. And that might vary from ink to ink. Some inks are runnier than others, so that worked out nicely. Cleanup, I find, is also very nice. You have to be careful though. Again, you don't want to get over enthusiastic and dip that paper in the water, but it requires very little water to clean the nib off. Because there's very little ink left on the nib. Yeah, that's very easy. Let's try the fine nib. Okay, like I mentioned earlier, once the ink comes out of contact with the nib slit, you may get, a little bit of ink left on the nib. I'm kind of surprised this one wrote more than the extra fine did, but that will depend a lot on how much ink is stuck to the nib. That can vary from dip to dip. Now, I will say the fine nib did not write as uniformly as the extra fine did. The extra fine, I couldn't tell a difference between writing with a feed, providing ink to the nib, and dipping it. But the fine nib, I could tell a difference. It went from dry, it would get a little wetter, and then a little drier. So far, the extra fine has been the most like an actual nib and feed writing experience. And I found that to be true with the writing sample that I did with writer's blood. I'll show that in just a minute. Now I'm going to try another Pilot Explorer. This one has the medium nib. And you can see I've got a bit of ink on the front and back. This is a pretty viscous ink, I believe. It tends to stick to the nib anytime I've done dip tests with actual feeds. The medium nib, since it's putting down more ink, ran out of ink a little bit faster. Other than this little wispy start to the writing, I felt like this wrote fairly uniformly. And that may have had a little bit to do with how the ink was distributed on the nib itself before I started writing. And finally, I'm going to try my Pilot Metropolitan that has a calligraphy medium nib. Here's a look at how the ink is distributed on the nib. I kind of want the nib slit to soak some of that ink up. It looks like, I don't know, because I don't want it to come off all in one big blob at the beginning. Okay, and It did the same thing that it did with the writing sample that I did with writer's blood. It came off really quickly at the beginning and ran dry. So this application is not going to work for a calligraphy medium nib. It looks like it works fairly well for the medium and the fine, and it's excellent for an extra fine nib. I'm going to take a close-up look at the other writing samples. These first 4 writing samples were done with the extra fine nib. Now this first one was my very first try, and I just didn't dip it in the ink enough. But the next 3 did really well. Just like with the Tokiwa Matsu, they wrote nice and uniformly, and I got at least 1 A5 size line or more, depending on the type of ink and how good of a dip I got. Now the next 4 writing samples are the fine, medium, and these 2 are the calligraphy medium. Just like with the Tokiwa Matsu, the fine nib had a little bit of a wispy start, but then wrote fairly uniformly. I was able to get nearly an entire A5 size line. With the medium, it started out a little too wet and then got dry before I made it to the end of the line. I did 2 tries with the calligraphy medium, and it just came off the nib too quickly, and I wasn't able to even write the entire name of the ink. The reason I was motivated to try this is I'm getting ready to make an updated video about the inks that I enjoy using in an extra fine nib, and I went back and rewatched my original video, and I remembered having to clean out the nib and feed after every writing sample, and I really was not looking forward to doing that again. So when I tried this and it worked, I mean, I was just as excited as I would have been if I had gotten a new pen in the mail. So now I still think the true Pilot Iro-utsushi dip nib is a worthwhile investment. The only reason this works for me is I've got multiple extra fine nibs that I'm not using. And in fact, I'll probably use this Koküno for the video just because I like the way it looks. But I would like to have this Koküno available to actually use these inks that I discovered work well with extra fine nibs. My extra fine Pilot 78G will probably become my default dip nib that I use for testing inks from now on. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.